Hello RGL3300 students, back today for lesson 11 in this course. We will still have our Zoom call, of course, at the regular class hour this afternoon. The Zoom calls are there for you to use. That can be up to an hour of Q&A, or it can be 5 minutes, depending upon whether students come prepared to ask questions. If you have questions about your term papers, that's when to ask them. If you have questions about anything else related to the course, that's when to ask them, okay? So be prepared for this afternoon Zoom call. You will notice that I've also added an extra day, so now it's Thursday at 11:30 for the delivery of your course paper for the term. Don't miss that deadline, all right? Make sure you check your Turnitin score, etc., etc., the standard practices, okay? Today we're going to be looking at lesson 11, Health Product Vigilance Systems, as you can see on your screen. Let's go on with that. Now this area, of course, is something that you've received a lot of instruction on from some of your other courses, but in the interest of covering it 3 times, I will go through it with more of a focus on post-market surveillance. All right? We know all the standard arguments we use for post-market surveillance, and in pharma drugs it's obviously a very key consideration. We know that pre-market approval of drugs and clinical trials cannot cover the genetic diversity of the population. Therefore, we would expect that and because people are ingesting these drugs directly, or they're having them injected into them, or any number of other exposure pathways for these medicines, it's clearly post-market surveillance becomes a really critical issue for pharma. And most OECD systems in post-market surveillance are very similar. Mandatory adverse reaction reporting, mandatory adverse reaction reporting during clinical trials, annual summary reporting for high-risk drugs, issue-related summary reporting for high-risk drugs, risk management plans, public access to post-market surveillance systems, post-market regulatory compliance, information bridging involving scanning international reports, tools for monitoring and evaluating vigilance data for signs of impending risks, etc., are pretty common to most pharmacovigilance systems, regardless of the country we're dealing with, if it's an OECD member and has a sophisticated regulatory system for pharma. Now, it's important to realize that anyone, including consumers, patients, caregivers, physicians, pharmacists, nurses, dentists, can report an adverse reaction. But those will, in many cases, be a bit more haphazard, a bit more voluntary based than a lot, except for maybe the doctors, nurses, and pharmacists. But the market authorization holder, that is the company that's producing the drugs and distributing them, are required to report based on Canada's Food and Drugs Act. Okay? It's important to make that distinction. Pharmacovigilance is defined as the science and activities relating to the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects or any other drug-related problem. Canada has its Good Pharmacovigilance Practices program at the Health Products and Food Branch Inspectorate and the Marketed Health Products Directorate. Okay, I include some notes of the various websites you can use. Those should be active on your version of the presentation once you turn it into presentation mode. If it's not, you can look up these things and reactivate the URLs. Okay. Canada's program involves manufacturers reporting an annual summary report of all information relating to adverse drug reactions and serious adverse drug reactions that it received or became aware of during the previous 12 months. This is required by basically all manufacturers. Health Canada can at any time request that our manufacturers submit an issue-related summary report. For example, if Health Canada receives a report or gets a call in from a lot of physicians, or is concerned by a public health group, or whatever, the department can require a special report from the manufacturer. Manufacturers of new drugs must establish and maintain records respecting any unusual failure in the efficacy of a new drug, and these must be maintained for 25 years. So that's a substantial record-keeping requirement. Upon receipt of any information of any unusual failure in the efficacy of a drug, the domestic manufacturer or importer designated as responsible for the pharmacovigilance must report to Health Canada within 15 days of becoming aware of the information. The penalties for not doing so can be quite severe. So that's an important issue if you're working as a regulatory affairs person in a pharma company. Additionally, the Marketed Health Products Branch, Health Canada, has worked to establish the Drug Safety and Effectiveness Network created within the Canadian Institutes for Health Research to complete post-approval studies. So this would be special studies where the department has got some concerns. The reports are not adequate to satisfy those concerns in terms of the information requirements to determine severity or risk. And so various post-market research special projects can be conducted, all right, by Health Canada as well. Now, it's understood that post-market surveillance in the area of drugs, pharmacovigilance, is a shared responsibility between the government and industry, with industry taking a major role in that activity. And of course, the health practitioners play a major role, and so does the public. These warnings or concerns about drugs can come from multiple sources. But the obvious ones are obviously the companies themselves, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and things like that, okay? And because drugs are a international industry. So pharmacovigilance is basically an internationalized exercise, primarily coordinated via the OECD. So Canada participates in virtually all the major international pharmacovigilance partnerships and agreements, okay? And through the OECD, countries like Canada are shifting to more proactive approaches for sharing information, concerns they have about drugs between countries, and so on and so forth. There's a shift towards a more proactive life cycle approach to regulating all health products in all of these jurisdictions, again, primarily fed by the OECD. Participation in and the adoption and implementation of the International Conference on Harmonization Guidelines for Health Product Vigilance. Canada has been very active there. Participation in the Global Harmonization Task Force for Medical Devices. Again, Canada has been very active in this area. And we also monitor consistently the results of clinical trials in other countries, particularly those countries where we have mutual recognition agreements, which we've already talked about in our course, okay? And we're certainly working to strengthen and align product vigilance systems and legislation and guidelines between countries, so that when we receive information from another country, we know that that information fits a certain standard. It fits into the system in a certain way. It's this quality or this type of information, and therefore it can be brought into our own system more systematically, our own databases, our own reporting mechanisms, and so on. To the extent that that's all standardized, it streamlines the international pharmacovigilance system, okay? Now, as I said, you've received a lot of this in some of your other courses, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You have the slides. You know what goes on in pharmacovigilance. You know the logic of pharmacovigilance. You know the reporting requirements and so on. And because that system is much more contained, much more based on a professional network, much more based on control of who receives the product and who doesn't through prescriptions and pharmacies and so on, and all the rules that go around that, it makes the pharmacovigilance systems a more sophisticated, more tight network of post-market surveillance than you would find in pesticides and industrial chemicals. But nevertheless, it also has its issues, right? And some of those issues we're working on through international collaboration because, obviously, drugs related to health and safety drug concerns are international concerns because the industry is global. So pharmaceuticals are basically not a national industry. They're a global industry. We have our national suppliers in a small scale for generics and so on. But even Canadian generics are exported products, substantial exported products to the U.S. and elsewhere. So it's a heavily global industry, and pharmacovigilance must therefore follow and be a heavily global approach. And Canada is certainly doing that. Okay. Now this final slide gives you sort of a picture of what's going on in pharmacovigilance. You may have seen this picture on Health Canada's websites or whatever. But it is a good caption to look at the entire system through one flow diagram. Okay. So on that, I'll end, because, like I say, you've covered this off quite a bit in some of your other courses, but we're covering it here. You have the slides, and we'll go from there. So I'll talk to you this afternoon in our Zoom call, and do keep plugging away. Okay. Bye bye for now.